Thank you, Erica. All right, for the next speaker, certainly almost everyone in the DevOps community knows the name John Allspaw. In fact, if there were a starting gun in the DevOps movement, it was the famous talk that he gave at the Velocity Conference in 2009, where he, as the VP of Operations at Flickr, co-presented with Paul Hammond, a director of development in the Yahoo mothership, talked about doing 10 deploys a day, every day. I finally got to meet John Allspaw in person at the DevOps Days in Mountain View in 2010. It's a meeting I'll never forget, and over the years I've learned so much from him. He got his master's degree from Lund University back when he was CTO of Etsy. His advisors included the famous Dr. Richard Cook and Dr. Sidney Decker and Dr. David Woods, famous for their contributions to the safety and resilience engineering community. He now works with Dr. Cook and Dr. Woods as partners at Adaptive Capacity Labs. He told me a couple of months ago about how much he's learned working with them, taking his colleagues' expertise to study incidents deeply, just as what Erica just shared. What dazzles me so much about John's work is that he believes that by understanding how organizations handle incidents, we can gain incredible clues on how those organizations learn. I can't think of a better presentation to follow Erica's amazing presentation than John Allspaw, who has contributed so much to this space. Please welcome John.
Oh, thanks, Gene. Thanks for that introduction. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the patterns that we've seen emerge in our work with Adaptive Capacity Labs over about the past 3 years or so. During this time, we've had the opportunity to observe and explore the real nitty-gritty, the actual messy details of how organizations learn from incidents, handle incidents, perceive what they mean, and the value that they think they might get from their experience. While the size and the type of these companies vary quite a bit, everything from 100 person to 30,000 people, established sort of decades old B2B and SaaS companies to consumer facing startups, we've seen some common patterns. And so I'm going to describe some of these patterns, some of which will probably run counter to some typical beliefs in the industry, and some of which might pose dilemmas for businesses, and finally some others that might point to some, well, I would say, undiscovered or competitive advantages that are being left on the table. So I won't spend too much time about me. As Gene mentioned, my master's is in human factors and system safety from Lund University. My career has mostly been in software. Prior to that, I was CTO at a company called Etsy, and I've written a couple of books that you can see here. So before I start, I want to make a couple of things clear. The first is that these are only a few of the most common patterns that we've seen. I have a short period of time to describe in detail what these are, so they're not going to include, it's not going to be comprehensive. And these are across organizations that we've come into contact with, both clients and non-clients. And the second is that these reflections, these patterns that I'm going to describe to you, these judgments aren't a comment. These comments aren't a judgment on any single organization. These are common sort of themes, if you will, that we've seen. So here's the sort of summary slide. If there's any slide you wanted to read, it would be this one. Here's what we've observed across the industry. The first is that the state of maturity in the industry on learning from events is quite low. And we've been doing this for some years now. And I think that there's a huge gap between what businesses believe they are state of maturity wise, or their ability to learn from incidents, and what they're actually doing. I would say that tech leadership in particular fundamentally misunderstands what it means to effectively learn from incidents versus fixing things quickly. We'll talk more about that. The second is that there's a significant gap between how technology leaders and hands-on practitioners view what it means to learn from incidents. And we find these sort of miscalibrations between leadership and hands-on staff in a couple of different ways that I'll describe. The third is that learning from incidents is typically given low priority. Given what we've just said in number 1 and number 2, this would make sense. The sort of fixes quickly sort of approach can lead to rushed fixes, which might actually paradoxically make things more vulnerable to future outages than making things safe. And the last is overconfidence, and overconfidence in what sort of the typical historical shallow incident metrics mean. And there's a significant amount of energy that's wasted in sort of tabulating them. They're frequently gamed, and they don't have much predictive value. They're about as signal strength as lines of code. So there's this pattern. If this pattern right here is perhaps the most prevalent that we've seen, as well as sort of concerning. And so there's this gap between people who have the everyday lived experience of designing preventative measures and responding to incidents, and tech leadership. When an incident happens, there's a gap between what's actually learned about the incident, how that learning takes place in the organization versus how they imagine it might take place, and what the incident actually means. Remember, incidents aren't these singular